Westy, I'm making it my mission. I'm about to line him up with a fade.
No way did you hit that!
Let's go!
Oh, what a shot!
Oh my days.
Have you ever wondered if Warzone is easier in America? Now, it has been a conversation for a very long time in the Warzone space that lobbies in North America, and American lobbies in particular, seemingly are easier than their European counterparts. And this isn't just a conversation. People have genuinely been manipulating regions for a while now, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. Now I know the 40% American audience right now who watch my videos are instantly going to be in the comments section claiming that people are delusional or don't know what they're talking about. And maybe they're right. So I decided to get to the bottom of this conversation today in another flagrant disregard for my own sleeping pattern because, good God, is it in the trenches? I decided to find out if there are any genuine differences between North American lobbies and EU lobbies, and are there even more differences? Is Warzone harder on the west coast of America, or is it harder on the east coast of America? Because conversations on this channel online simply aren't enough. There must be some hard-earned evidence or data that we try and collect, and that's exactly what I'm doing today. Speaking of a 40% American audience, 80% of you watching this video right now probably aren't subscribed. You probably just click on my videos when they appear. So if you want to support the channel directly, consider becoming a subscriber today. It takes 2 seconds, and we're on the road to 200k, and it helps me make more of these intricate videos and various deep dives getting to the bottom of things. The like button is also quite handy. So before I dive into the why I'm doing this and how I'm doing this, I decided to focus specifically on Europe and North America for a reason. I mean, if I wanted to play against players from Asia, I simply would just play European lobbies in the middle of the day, because good God, the real loser right now is Ricochet Anti-Cheat, and it is an absolute hellscape in pretty much all regions, by the way, which we will touch on a little bit later. Things have been getting quite tricky. But generally speaking, playing in regions like Asia and in OCE are a little bit more challenging from a domestic setup. But as a side note to all of my friends out there from that region, I have actually played Warzone lobbies in Australia, and I did a live stream of here on the channel, and I gotta tell you, you guys are firmly in the trenches. I don't think there's any debating that. If you're an Australian watching this right now, believe me, as a European player and a North American player, you objectively have it the worst of any region. So let's talk about the why I'm doing this. Now, this isn't just about conversations happening online or streamers like myself saying that North America is easier, and I have said that before. Those are words that have left my mouth on stream. The reason I'm doing this is because there's more to this than just a conversation. People are actively moving towards North America when playing things like multiplayer ranked or Warzone ranked, and during Modern Warfare 2's Big Map ranked, people in Europe were actively VPNing to North America East lobbies in the hope of getting a more easier SR gain on a day-to-day basis. Part of that was avoiding cheaters, and we will have a conversation about just how much cheating has manipulated the entire base of regions. But generally speaking, most people played with an American host or an American counterpart to simply try and get an easier run of things. So this is more than just a conversation. This isn't just people online being snotty, being annoying, being people like me, content creators with several thousand opinions that change every 5 minutes. This is something people have actively been doing and have an active belief that if you play North American lobbies, you are getting easier players. So that's why I decided to do this video. Next, let's talk about the how. Now, I referenced before that my sleep pattern is in the trenches, and the reason for that is because I played both squad games and solo games in NA East, NA West, and in Europe during the early hours of the morning for all of those regions, and also during the peak hours of the day. And there's a really big reason that I did that we'll touch on in the results, and it's to do with a big perception gap around skill-based matchmaking. So as you can imagine, as a silly man who exists in London, United Kingdom, this meant playing NA East servers and NA West servers at 8 PM and also in the morning. And for those of you who are familiar with your time zones, 8 PM in NA West, for example, is 4 o'clock in the morning over here. And 8 PM on NA East, for example, is something closer to like 1 o'clock in the morning. And in the background, you'll see various bits of footage from EU and also from NA East lobbies. There might be a splash of NA West, but if I'm honest with you, the latency was quite challenging, and I ultimately was just judging it off of some things that I experienced. And it's worth me mentioning overarchingly, I am not pulling hardline data about lobby KDs from this. Doing that involves cheating, and I'm absolutely not going to engage in that. But what I am showing you is various observations from somebody who has been doing this and playing in both regions for a number of years. So let's talk about the results. Are there any results? Is there any noticeable difference between NA and EU? Is one region harder? Is one region easier? Or is there a much more complex conversation to have about all of this? Now, there is actually a slightly more detailed and intricate conversation to have around skill-based matchmaking and also cheating, which we will get to a little bit later. But generally speaking, there is a pretty substantial difference between EU lobbies and NA lobbies, and the reason that this might sound mildly insulting, or you might completely disagree with it, is something we'll touch on later, because you're not necessarily wrong. And if you think that me talking about EU lobbies is a joke, or that it isn't harder and what you've experienced is radically different from what I've experienced, I promise you, we're going to get into that part of the conversation. But generally speaking, there is a substantial cultural difference between how EU lobbies are played and how NA lobbies are played, and I would validly say that EU lobbies are more challenging. One of the biggest surprises I had hopping between Europe, North America, and even NA East and NA West was the type of devices people were playing on, the amount of voice chat you would receive, and what people were generally doing. In North America, you get lots of players on their microphones, all of them obviously speaking and conversating, many of them very clearly on console. But in Europe, you don't get that much, if at all, and the majority of the chat that happens in the game is actually in the text chat. And this leads me to my first significant cultural difference. For the most part in Europe, it feels as though there are far more players on PC, which obviously means higher frame rates, people are a little bit more invested in the competitive side of things. But the biggest thing that I think this changes, especially in relation to Warzone, is how people approach the game. EU players are very hardcore players when it comes to things like PUBG, for example. And PUBG had a huge adoption rate over here in Europe and was basically the bread and butter of this region for a number of years. And I genuinely believe that that attitude has bled into EU gameplay for Warzone. EU players, on the average EU player in Warzone, I'm not even talking about, the tippity top-end competitive players, play the game differently to North American players. They play far more positionally, they play specifically for power positions, and most of them utilize long-range weapons in a way that North American players tend not to do. You will see more snipers, more claymores, more locking down locations, people generally locking up locations and playing the game from a BR standpoint way more than you would in North America. On the flip side of that coin, in North America, you tend to find more players on console, more players chilling casually, more players who are ultimately on their microphone, on their gameplay, and not really taking the game ultra seriously. And NA players are more aggressive. NA players will take a fight. They will push their opponents, even if they don't think they necessarily have the odds best in their favor, there's less clinicalness to how they play the game. I'm not even saying that as a bad thing. I actually think it's the way Warzone's meant to be enjoyed. For me, it feels as though NA players across both regions, more so in NA West, attack the game differently to EU players. EU players will focus on different regions, different locations, and specifically the maps and buildings around them. NA players will chase whatever fight is in front of them. So to me personally, the average EU player in Warzone is better than the average North American player who plays the game. And the reason for that is just the sheer annoyingness of how EU players play Warzone. EU players play Warzone like it's PUBG, they play casual lobbies like they're playing ranked. NA players tend to attack more fights, and they're also generally playing a little bit more socially and a little bit more casually. And this general cultural divide is actually kind of supported by what you can see in the general regions for those games. Call of Duty generally has been very successful in North America, whilst in Europe, games like Battlefield and PUBG have had more successes than they have than their North American counterparts. Console sales generally tend to be more successful across North America than they are across Europe. So there is data, and even the gameplay that I've had, that suggests that I'm correct about saying how EU players play the game differently. But this is where that conversation ends. Because the biggest noticeable difference, and this is something that I talk about very often on stream, between the general regions and their general difficulty, isn't the caliber of the player, it's the time of the day. The major reason that this conversation around NA lobbies being easier exists is because people tend to forget about time zones and player population. When the player population at peak hours from 5 PM onwards is at its maximum, it means the skill-based matchmaking can work as hardcore as humanly possible because it's got the most number of players to choose from. But when the player pool is lower because it's earlier in the day, or it's the work day, or it's not a school holiday and it's first thing in the morning, then skill-based matchmaking can't work as efficiently as it wants to work, which means that it will put you in lobbies that are a bit more varied. So Europeans generally, when they're talking about NA lobbies being easier, are saying that from a conversational point of playing an NA region at 9 o'clock in the morning, or 1 PM, or midday. They're not talking about it from a standpoint of playing the region when it's at its peak, because this is where the big conversational factor comes in. Regardless of where you play Warzone in the world, if you play from 4 or 5 o'clock onwards in the afternoon into the evening, it is going to feel like hell regardless. Granted, I still think there are some cultural differences in how EU and NA players play, and I would say generally the average EU player seems to be a little bit more clued up on playing for endgame. But what I will say is this: if you play in those peak hours, there is no difference. It's going to be hell in West Coast, it's going to be hell in East Coast, it's going to be hell if you're playing in Europe, and it's not going to change, and it doesn't matter what region you're playing in. And the reality is, the perception gap that exists around different regions and why this conversation exists is because people forget about minor details like player population and time zones, and the fact that, yeah, most regions tend to be pretty easy at 9 o'clock in the morning. But for my Americans out there who have graced the world with people like Baker Mayfield and the National Football League, there is a further conversation to be had, because there is a difference between NA West and NA East. NA East, I would actually argue, is a little bit more challenging than NA West, and you tend to notice more casual gameplay on West Coast servers. Now, granted, all of this is subject to what I just said, whereas if you're playing at 5 PM onwards, there is going to be painstakingly no difference, everyone's suffering the same. But I actually think the reason that you find more trouble in NA East servers than NA West servers is actually because of European players. You see, the majority of us have actually gotten into the habit of going to North American East servers when cheating gets bad, because the general perception being that ping from places like China and most parts of Asia tends to get too long, too powerful, and too difficult for them to play. So NA East almost ends up being this sort of safe haven away from those lobbies. And a lot of us over the last year or two have pretty religiously moved over to NA East lobbies and played there when the game has been in a dumpster fire. So I would actually argue that at this point, NA East probably has a higher population at times than NA West servers, and I actually think the playstyles I've alluded to and people being a bit more campy and positional have probably bled into NA East lobbies a bit more than people realize. And this has actually been touched on by T-Captain, who posted a tweet saying that he found that NA West lobbies were pretty much a cakewalk. Now, again, I do want to reiterate that all of this does not matter if you play at peak hours, because I promise you, you are going to suffer the same hells. And at pretty much any late hour of the day from my own gameplay, I can tell you there's no difference, guys. Everybody's a demon, everybody's sway, everybody's powerful. But when you have a bit more lobby variance and you get access to SBMM that's a little bit more loose, generally speaking, yeah, I would say there is a bit of a difference between NA East and NA West. And generally speaking, I would say that the European lobbies tend to be the most challenging of them all. So this conversation is very much a separate conversational approach. You know, we're talking about a region like North America, which traditionally has the most pro Call of Duty players. Granted, what I will say about all of that is that that's primarily because North America gets the majority of the funding, and the actual competitive budget for Warzone seemingly exists from the North American market only, and has a little less to do with development in the EU region. But I would say the average player conversation is a different conversation. The average player conversation actually does come down to a few cultural differences. But that being said, the average player when SBMM at its maximum is no different. So there are some differences. EU lobbies do definitely play a little bit differently. NA lobbies, depending on your region, can also play a little bit differently. But is the conversation of America being easier an overwashed conversation? I would probably say so. I think the reality is the biggest factor in all of these regions is just how efficient skill-based matchmaking is. And it isn't the case that Americans are just somewhat dead easy at the game, more the case that the times you will encounter American players often when you're in the EU region is times of day when most of them aren't online or the maximum amount of SBMM can't be achieved, which is why this conversation exists. Now, there is a wider conversation about all of this about anti-cheat. Right now, it doesn't exist. I played 4.5 hours of Warzone today, and we didn't have a single lobby that didn't involve a cheater. And I do wonder at this point how much of a migration North American East servers are seeing because of this happening. The majority of us who play in EU are trying to avoid the situation that's happening in our lobbies, and we do that by going to NA East in the hope that the ping difference will be enough to dissuade most of those players. And I do think it has a lot to say that the conversation around anti-cheat has genuinely gotten so bad that it is bleeding into actual regional matchmaking at this point. So folks, that's about it for this video today. NA lobbies are not necessarily easier. They are a little bit different, but not necessarily easier. And this video hopefully has demonstrated a little bit around all of that. If you found this video interesting, drop a like down below, consider subscribing as well, we're on the road to 200k, and let me know your experiences. I want to hear what it's like from an average EU or NA player who primarily plays at peak hours. How hard is it? How difficult do you find it? And I'll see you all again in the next video.